The pool was full. I don't mean with water, I mean with people. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the drained concrete basin, dozens of them, dry as paper in the dead desert heat of 3 in the morning, all looking up at me with the same patient expression you saw on churchgoers waiting for a sermon to begin. The pool lights had not worked since my 2nd week, but there was enough moonlight to show me details I would have given anything not to see. A little girl in a yellow raincoat with dust on the cuffs, a trucker whose throat was lined with old staples, Teresa, barefoot, one side of her face blurred like wet ink, and the Ortega family, exactly as they had looked in the grainy photographs from my old case file, except their eyes were open too wide, and they were all smiling at me, as if I had finally done the decent thing and come home. The intercom crackled above the office door. "Mason," it said in my own voice, calm and amused. "You keep mistaking rules for protection. Rules were only ever a way to measure how quickly you could be taught." Something moved beside me. I turned, and the man from room 14 was standing at the ice machine, close enough that I could smell blood and freezer burn on him. "Don't let it choose the next version of you," he whispered. Then every room door on the property opened at once. 3 nights earlier, I took the night clerk job at the Sundown Motor Lodge because it paid cash for the first 2 weeks and asked no questions I didn't want to answer. That wasn't how Teresa phrased it, but that was the shape of the offer. She was a narrow, tired woman in her late 50s, with hair the color of cigarette ash and a way of watching doorways instead of faces. She interviewed me in the front office at 4:30 in the afternoon, while the desert outside looked bleached and enormous. There were 12 guest rooms in the main strip, 6 in the long-term residence wing, an empty pool courtyard in the center, a laundry outbuilding near the rear fence, and a maintenance corridor beneath the property that had supposedly been sealed before I was born. The Interstate sat half a mile away, near enough that you could hear the long-haul trucks on the right nights, far enough that most travelers missed the turnoff unless they were desperate, broke, or lost. I qualified for at least 2 of those. The office smelled like dust, lemon disinfectant, and old coffee burned down to its minerals. Teresa asked about register experience, late-night shifts, and whether I had any problems being alone for long periods. I lied, in a measured, professional tone I had used for years in insurance interviews. It came naturally, too naturally. Officially, I had left my previous job because I wanted a change. Unofficially, I had left before anyone could ask me why I had ignored evidence in the Ortega file. It had been a fire claim on a small house outside Phoenix. The company believed Raul Ortega had staged the fire for payout. I found time-stamped warehouse footage that put him 40 miles away when the blaze started. I also found evidence that would have supported accidental electrical failure. If I had turned that over, the fraud unit would have lost the prosecution angle, and my supervisor, who had hinted pretty clearly about a promotion, would have been embarrassed. So I delayed. I buried things. I let the version of the story that helped me survive become the official one. A month late, the charges were dropped for lack of evidence. But by then, the family had already imploded under the pressure. Raul disappeared. Marisol and their daughter were gone from the temporary apartment the company had placed them in. There were no bodies, no note, nothing concrete enough to prosecute or apologize to. You can do ugly things in an office and still keep your hands clean. That was the talent that got me to the Sundown. Teresa hired me before sunset. She showed me the ledger, the key hooks, the security monitor with its grainy black and white feeds, and the breaker switch that controlled the vacancy sign. Then, as if remembering something she'd nearly forgotten, she opened a drawer and handed me a typed sheet of paper. It held 5 rules. Do not rent room 8 after midnight. If a guest asks for room 14, tell them it is under renovation. Never enter the pool area after 2 in the morning. Ignore anyone standing beside the ice machine. If the vacancy sign turns off by itself, lock the office door. I read them twice, then looked up. "What is this?" I asked. "Instructions." "For what?" The night shift. I smiled before I could stop myself. It wasn't contempt exactly, more like relief. A faded motel in the desert with a superstitious owner was easier to understand than a company investigation, a missing family, and the private fact that I had helped break them. "You get a lot of weird drifters through here?" I asked. "We get a lot of people," Teresa said. Her eyes moved to the west window. The sunlight was thinning into red. "Most of them are ordinary. Most." She said it flatly enough that I felt, for a second, the small mechanical hitch in my chest that used to happen when a witness contradicted a polished statement, but the feeling passed. I folded the sheet and put it in my pocket. "I'll manage." "I'm sure you think you will." It should have annoyed me. Instead, I laughed. Teresa gave me a key ring with room masters, a flashlight heavy enough to use as a weapon, and a warning not to bother the residents in the far wing unless they bothered me first. There were 3 of them, she said, or 4. Her uncertainty struck me as odd, but the whole property had that quality, a place assembled from useful leftovers, held together by habit and the unwillingness to start over. By 7:30, the sky was purple over the interstate, and Teresa was leaving. At dawn, she said from the office door, "Count the towels from the laundry before you cash out." I nodded. She rested one hand on the frame. "You'll understand after a few nights." Then she was gone, her pickup trailing dust down the access road. I spent the first hour of my shift inventorying key cards, logging soda purchases, and watching the security feeds. The office monitor showed the front lot, the pool gate, the rear service lane, the laundry entrance, and a narrow angle on the ice machine outside room 6. The picture skipped every few seconds, but I could still see enough to judge the place ordinary. A trucker in room 3 bought aspirin. A young couple in room 9 argued quietly in the parking lot, then made up before they got to their door. A resident from the long-term wing crossed the courtyard, carrying a grocery sack, and never looked toward the office. At 10:15, I stepped outside to smoke, even though I'd quit 2 years earlier. The desert at night always felt temporary to me, as if the land had agreed to cool itself only until dawn changed its mind. The motel sign buzzed in red and blue. The pool in the courtyard was an empty rectangle of cracked concrete, fenced off by chain link. Near the rear row, the ice machine gave a single metallic clack from inside its dented white housing. That was all. No whispering shapes, no crying in the walls, no handprints on the windows. I remember feeling insultingly calm. It embarrassed me, looking back, how quickly I decided the rules were theater. I had spent years translating panic into paperwork, fear into clauses, guilt into procedural distance. A typed list from a motel owner was never going to compete with the lies I already knew how to live inside. Around midnight, I took the sheet out again and read it one more time, not because I believed it, but because I was bored. Then, I slid it under the register and waited for something strange to happen. Nothing did. That was the first thing the place taught me. It never started with something you could point to. The first week trained me into the wrong kind of confidence. If terror had arrived all at once, I might have left. If the rules had punished me immediately, I might have respected them. But the sundown seemed to understand how people worked. It offered manageable oddness, small enough to dismiss, consistent enough to become background noise. Most nights as I handled truckers, sales reps, couples too angry to keep driving, and one exhausted mother with 2 boys, who slept so hard in the lobby chairs while she filled out the form, I nearly gave them the room for free. People came in carrying the usual interstate fatigue. Skin salted by travel, voices flattened by too much road, eyes skimming for vacancy and privacy rather than safety. The motel gave them both. Nothing about the place looked haunted. Neglected, yes. Cheap, definitely. The office air conditioner clicked like bad teeth. The pool was dry and fenced. Half the parking lot bulbs were amber with bugs. But it remained comprehensible. That was what made the details easy to excuse. The vacancy sign, for instance, flickered even after Teresa swore she had replaced the wiring in spring. Around 1 in the morning, it sometimes dimmed until only the VAC glowed red, then brightened again before I could get up from the desk. Once, while I was adding up receipts, it shut off entirely, for maybe 4 seconds. I looked at the switchboard, expecting a tripped breaker, but everything stayed live. By the time I reached the front window, the sign hummed back on as if it had only blinked. I remembered Teresa's rule about locking the office door if the sign went dark by itself. I also remembered I was 34 years old, alone in a motel office, and not inclined to jump at electrical problems. So I didn't lock it. Nothing happened. The figure by the ice machine appeared the second night. I saw them first on the monitor, someone standing just left of the machine, where the camera caught the white panel and a slice of concrete between rooms 6 and 7. They were tall, thin, and motionless. Because of the lousy image quality, I couldn't even tell if it was a man or a woman. I assumed it was a guest smoking in the dark. 20 minutes later, I checked again, and the figure hadn't moved. At 12:50, I stepped outside and looked down the row. Someone was still there, half turned toward the machine, hands at their sides. "Need something?" I called. They walked away, not hurriedly, not guiltily. They simply turned and moved past room 7 with a smooth, measured pace, until the darkness between the residence wing and the rear fence swallowed them. The space beside the machine looked suddenly colder than the rest of the lot. I nearly went after them. Then a man in room 2 rang the bell for more towels, and the whole thing became unimportant. By the 4th night, I had decided the ice machine person was either a resident with odd habits or a local who liked creeping out the new clerk. Whenever I looked directly at them, they walked off before I got close. It became, perversely, reassuring. They were part of the property's character, like the sign buzz or the old chlorine smell that drifted from the empty pool whenever the temperature dropped. I found the handwritten notes on the 6th night in the left drawer beneath Teresa's typed rules. Most were on motel stationery, folded and refolded until the paper felt cloth thin. Some were dated years apart. A few had no dates at all. If room 8 calls the office after 1 in the morning, do not answer. The pool rule only matters if there are guests outside. If a woman in a red coat asks whether the tunnel is open, tell her it collapsed. Do not trust guests who arrive alone. That last note had been crossed out so many times that the paper was nearly torn through. On the back, in a different hand, someone had written, "That was never the rule." The rule was do not trust the ones who know your name before you tell them. I sat at the desk, reading them like a pile of local legends. You could feel the accumulation of night shift boredom in them, the human need to make patterns out of inconvenience. Previous clerks embellishing for sport. Teresa was collecting the more useful ones because the rules made people feel equipped. Still, one detail bothered me, the contradictions. If room 8 shouldn't call after 1, why wasn't that on Teresa's list? If the pool only mattered when guests were outside, why simplify it? Why cross out one rule and replace it with another? Why type 5 instructions with all the confidence of policy and then stuff a drawer with exceptions? My old job had taught me that contradictions meant either deception or evolution. People lied, yes, but systems also changed. Procedures got revised after accidents. Language hardened around what had already gone wrong. That thought stayed with me longer than it should have. On the 7th night, Teresa came in early to drop off fresh forms. I held up one of the notes. "You had a lot of creative clerks before me." She did not smile. Creative people die faster. I waited for the punchline. None came. What happened to them? Most quit. Most. She set the forms on the counter. "If you're going through the drawer, put everything back where you found it." I could have pushed harder. The investigator part of me wanted to, but I had taken this job precisely because I was tired of questions that led to rooms I couldn't morally afford to enter. So I let her leave without explaining herself. That night, for no real reason, I started following the rules more carefully. I refused a request to move a late-arriving trucker into room 8 at 12:30. I told him the plumbing was bad and put him in room 10 instead. When the pool gate rattled at 2:15, I stayed inside the office. When the vacancy sign blinked off for a full 10 seconds around 3, I locked the office door and sat listening to my own breathing until the red letters burned back on. Nothing happened. That was the real seduction. The rules cost almost nothing to obey, and disobeying them costs nothing I could see. After a week, the sundown felt less like a dangerous place and more like a test I was passing by, being smarter than everyone who had taken it too seriously. Confidence doesn't always feel like bravado. Sometimes it feels like relief. By the end of that first week, I was sleeping better in the staff room than I had in months. I thought I had found a place whose strangeness was small enough to manage. I thought wrong in the easiest possible way. The first real mistake I made did not feel like a mistake. It felt like boredom. Business was dead that night. No trucks on the frontage road, no reservation calls, no foot traffic except a lean old man from the residence wing who bought a soda and studied me, as if deciding whether I reminded him of someone he disliked. Midnight came and went, with the quiet pressure of desert dark against the windows. The monitor showed empty walkways, black room doors, and the ice machine shining faintly under its yellow bulb. At 12:47, the lobby bell rang. The man standing at the counter looked like every unremarkable traveler I had ever processed, and, at the same time, like no one I would ever willingly remember. Mid-40s maybe. The gray sports coat is too warm for the season. A fresh scrape at his temple, as if he had caught his head on a doorframe. He smiled with ordinary politeness. "Need a room for the night," he said. "Sure." He slid cash across the counter. "Any preference?" 14, he said. The number landed between us as a coin spun on edge. I actually felt a small thrill then. The childish kind you get when a ghost story finally remembers to present the ghost. Teresa's second rule rose in my head. Tell them it is under renovation. Instead, I heard myself say, "That one's available." He watched me, smile unchanged. "You're certain? Unless you know something I don't." "Not yet," he said. I should have noticed that phrasing. I should have noticed a lot of things. I checked him in under the name E. Vale, because that was what he wrote in the ledger. Though the signature was so clean and fast, it looked practiced rather than natural. He took the key card, thanked me, and walked out into the lot without luggage. I watched on the monitor as he moved past the pool gate and down the far row to room 14. The room Teresa claimed was under renovation, even though the only visible issue was the warped trim around the door. He swiped in, stepped inside, and disappeared. Nothing dramatic followed. No scream, no power outage, no shadow under the door. At 1:13, the office phone rang once from an internal line, then stopped before I answered. The display was blank. At 1:30, the vacancy sign flickered. At 2, the figure appeared beside the ice machine and remained there for nearly an hour. I kept waiting for some direct consequence to attach itself to the man in 14. By dawn, the lot was quiet. When I checked the room after my shift, it was empty. Not emptied. Empty. The bed cover was smooth. The bathroom was dry. No cigarette smell. No used towel. No discarded soap wrapper. Not even a crease in the second pillow. If I hadn't logged the cash and written the keycard issue, I might have believed I had imagined the whole thing. That should have unsettled me more than it did. Instead, it gave me the worst kind of permission. Teresa never mentioned the unauthorized rental. Either she didn't check the ledger closely, or she already knew and chose not to say anything. The lack of consequences hardened into a private joke. I had violated the most specific rule on the page and discovered the secret beneath it. There was none. Over the next several nights, I got careless in increments. When room 8 called at 1:06 in the morning, after I found the handwritten note warning me not to answer, I picked up on the third ring, Static, then breathing. Not frightened breathing, not human effort. More like the soft intake of a sleeper turning in bed. "Front office," I said. The line clicked dead. I checked the register. Room 8 was unoccupied. I went down there with the flashlight, opened the door, and found the room dark, cold, and bare, except for the standard furniture. The bathroom mirror had a long crack running through it that I could have sworn wasn't there the previous day. I wrote it down for maintenance and told myself that was the end of it. A night later, I entered the pool courtyard at 2:20 after hearing voices through the office wall. The gate squealed. The concrete basin lay empty below me, painted with moonlight and dead leaves. I stood there long enough to notice the strange damp smell that always came from the place after midnight, as if water still remembered the shape of where it used to be. Nothing grabbed me. No one rose from the deep end. Another time, I lingered by the ice machine when the figure was there. Up close, they looked like a man in a pale work shirt, hands scarred and hanging loose at his sides. He stood with his head slightly bowed, not looking at me. "You waiting on someone?" I asked. He turned and walked away, just as always. I watched him go, irritated by how much effort the motel had invested in being coy. What I didn't understand then was that consequences at the sundown weren't theatrical. They were cumulative, like radiation, like mold in the walls, like guilt for that matter. You don't notice the damage at the moment of contact. You notice it later, when a pattern that once held begins to fail. The first failure seemed trivial. A woman in room 5 came to the office just before dawn and thanked me for bringing her extra blankets. I hadn't. "I'm sorry?" she frowned. "About an hour ago, you said the heater in the wall unit would cut out before sunrise." Her certainty made me uncomfortable. I never left the office. "Yes, you did." She gave a short, embarrassed laugh, the kind people use when they think you're joking inappropriately. "You knocked twice, set the blankets on the bed, and told me not to answer if room 8 called." The words landed hard enough that I forgot to speak. She looked at my face, and some of her own color faded. "Weren't you?" I said. It must have been the other clerk, though there was no other clerk. That morning, I checked the security footage. At 4:08 a.m., the monitor showed the hallway outside room 5. The woman opened her door. Blankets floated upward into the frame as if carried by someone standing just below the camera's angle. Then the door closed again. No one appeared to be entering or leaving. I watched it 6 times. By the end, I had already begun building rational explanations. Camera glitch, timestamp error, sleep deprivation, a prank too technical and pointless to make sense. That was another habit from my old life, reaching for the version of reality that required the least moral adjustment. It still worked on me then, even after the internal calls started coming more often. Even after I checked the ledger and found the name E. Vale no longer written on the line where I knew I had put it. Even after the entry for room 14 was gone entirely, leaving a clean blank space in the page, as if the motel had decided my memory was a clerical error it intended to correct. The motel didn't become frightening all at once. It became argumentative. That was the nearest I could come to describing the next phase. Reality around the sundown started disagreeing with itself in small, persistent ways. A guest would remember a conversation that had never happened. A key card would open a room different from the one printed on its sleeve. Someone would insist they had stayed the previous month, and I would check the records only to find no trace of them, until I checked again, an hour later, and found an entire folio page in my own handwriting. It was the kind of uncertainty that infected everything it touched. A family from Bakersfield checked into rooms 3 and 4 on a Tuesday. Around 2 in the morning, the father came to the office in socks and asked why I had moved them. "Moved you where?" "From 3 to 7, he said. My daughter woke up crying because she said the window was on the wrong wall. "You're in 3. "No, we're not." When I followed him outside, his keycard opened room 7. Their luggage was inside, their cooler, their daughter's stuffed rabbit on the second bed. The mother stared at me with the brittle expression of somebody trying not to blame the nearest available employee for something she couldn't explain. I checked the system. It still listed them in 3. I comped the night. They left before dawn. The footage got worse. People appeared in rooms they had never rented. Others failed to appear at all. One truck driver spent 15 minutes at the front desk arguing about a charge, and when I reviewed the camera afterward, the recording showed me standing alone, nodding into space, like a man practicing customer service for an invisible audience. By then, I had stopped telling Teresa everything, not because I thought she wouldn't believe me. I had come to suspect belief wasn't the issue. Teresa moved through the motel with the weary procedural patience of someone managing recurring damage, not investigating it. When I mentioned the vanishing footage, she only asked whether the gaps were longer than before. When I told her a guest had changed rooms overnight without moving their belongings, she asked which direction the room number had changed. Direction? Lower or higher? Higher, I said. 3 to 7. That made her press her lips together. Keep the office logs on paper, she said. Ink if possible. That's it? It's more useful than panic. Useful for what? She never said. Then the man from room 14 came back. He arrived just after midnight in a different car than before, though I couldn't have described the first one if you'd forced me. This time he wore a denim jacket and had a bruise darkening one eye. Same face, same careful smile, same cash. Evening, he said. I felt my throat tighten. Have we met? That depends on which night you mean. I stared long enough that he tilted his head slightly. Not in mockery, but in what looked like interest. We're full, I said. Behind me, the key rack held 6 open rooms. Of course, he said. Then I'll try again. He turned and walked away before I could ask anything else. When I checked the monitor, I saw him crossing the lot toward room 14 anyway. The camera skipped once. He was gone. The next night, he returned older by a decade, or seemed to. His hairline had thinned. There was a white bandage wrapped around 2 fingers of his left hand. He wore the same smile and asked for the same room, in the same voice. The night after that, they came in limping. And after that, he appeared on the monitor before I ever saw him enter the office. That was when the Ortega family began showing up. At first, it was only peripheral. A woman in the mirror of room 11 whose hair matched Marisol Ortega's driver's license photo. A little girl's laugh from the laundry room when I knew no children were checked in. The scent of burned plastic and wet drywall. The smell from the fire scene report, coming from empty hallways for no reason I could trace. Then the voices started. 1:30 in the morning. Internal call. No room number displayed. When I answered, a woman said, very softly, "Mr. Reeves?" It was the tone that undid me. Not accusing. Hopeful. I sat rigid at the desk. "Who is this? You were supposed to help us." The line crackled. A little girl in the background asked, "Is that the man from the papers?" I hung up hard enough to rattle the phone cradle. The caller ID, now lit, read, "Room 14." I didn't sleep after shifts anymore. I sat on the narrow bed in the staff room, replaying case details I had spent months trying to suppress. The warehouse footage, the withheld electrical report, Marisol's interview, where she kept smoothing her daughter's hair while I asked questions, designed less to find truth than to pin liability to the nearest vulnerable body. Memory can become a collaborator when you're already compromised. The sundown seemed to know exactly where to touch mine. I began checking room 14 every dawn. Sometimes it was empty. Sometimes it had signs of occupancy that vanished while I looked at them. A damp footprint near the tub, a Motel Bible opened face down, a pill bottle on the nightstand with the label turned away, until I blinked and found the table bare again. Once I saw 3 shadow shapes on the far wall, tall, short, tall, like a family standing close together. When I switched on the bathroom light, the wall was blank. I tried to tell myself the place was feeding on generic guilt, common anxieties, stress-induced pattern recognition. Then a woman in the office asked me why I was letting the Ortega child wander unsupervised near the pool. There was no child in the courtyard, but on the monitor, for a fraction of a second before the image rolled, I saw a little girl in a yellow raincoat standing at the dry deep end, looking up at the office window. I knew that coat. It had been listed in the property loss report. From then on, every ring of the phone felt like a summons. Every late guest carried the possibility of wearing some version of a dead case around their face. The motel had stopped merely behaving strangely. It had started selecting material, and I had handed it exactly what it needed the first night I decided one of Teresa's rules didn't matter. I found the journals because I stopped believing the office drawer held the whole story. There was a storage room behind the laundry building that Teresa kept padlocked. She used to carry the key on her main ring, but after a while, I noticed she'd leave it hanging inside the office cabinet while she went to clean rooms. One afternoon, after a shift spent listening to the Ortega voices argue quietly through an empty wall, I borrowed it. The storage room smelled of soap powder, rust, and trapped heat. Shelves leaned under old bed frames, broken lamps, yellowing boxes of invoices, and motel signage from decades when the sundown had apparently tried to look cheerful. Near the back, behind a stack of pool chairs with split vinyl straps, I found a metal file cabinet with no lock. Inside were journals, not official logs, personal ones, spiral notebooks, composition books, motel stationery bound with rubber bands. Some pages were swollen from humidity, some had edges darkened as if singed. The names on the first pages belonged to night clerks going back at least 30 years. At first, the entries looked mundane: inventory, complaints, notes on drunks, plumbing, weather, and pay. Then, around the years after the interstate bypass reduced traffic, the tone changed. Too many empty rooms now. Quiet feels different, like waiting. The people who come after 1 a.m. don't always park. It learns faster when spoken to. Don't repeat yourself. Teresa says the old rules worked when there were enough guests to dilute it. I don't know what that means. The further I read, the clearer the pattern became. The sundown had not always been dangerous in the same way. There were scattered incidents in older entries, voices near the tunnel, strange guests, missing footage. But they were infrequent, almost folkloric. Then the business collapsed, vacancy spread across the property, and something changed. The empty rooms didn't stay empty, or rather, emptiness itself became useful to whatever had taken root there. The clerks adapted in pieces. One created rules about mirrors, another insisted the threat could only imitate people it heard, introduced by full name. A third wrote that it had begun anticipating every avoidance behavior, which meant the rules themselves were becoming educational material. That thought returned over and over in different hands. We are training it. Near the bottom drawer, hidden inside a box of obsolete key fobs, I found Teresa's notebook. Her handwriting was thin and disciplined, every line angled hard right as if leaning away from something. Unlike the others, she didn't speculate much. She documented. The 978 tunnel collapse revealed an older foundation void beneath the east wing. Sealed. 1994 first record of a guest appearing in the register without a corresponding payment. 2008 traffic reduction. Occupancy falls below 40%. Anomalous incidents increase. 2012 entity begins retaining names and habits across separate nights. In 2017, Room 14 was designated for quarantine, not because it contains the phenomenon, because it attracts incomplete iterations before they stabilize elsewhere. I read that line 3 times. Not empty, quarantine. Below it. If occupied, do not interact beyond the assignment. Do not answer its questions. Do not let it study routine. And then, in darker ink, underlined twice, Mason rented 14, without instruction. If so, rules must be revised immediately. My stomach turned cold. She had known. or suspected quickly enough that the distinction no longer mattered. Further down, the notebook became uglier. Rules do not stop it. Rules, slow pattern acquisition. Observation is nourishment. Contradiction is a partial defense. It prefers guilt. Guilt provides stable identity material. Once it links to a personal unresolved event, it can recur in multiple forms. Never assume the same guest is singular. There it was at last, the thing my pride had kept me from seeing. Teresa's typed sheet had not been a complete guide because there could not be one. Those rules were merely the most efficient breaks she had left. Ways of reducing contact with certain states, certain rooms, certain expressions of the thing. And I had broken the worst of them almost immediately, not because I needed to, because I wanted proof that I was harder to fool than whoever came before me. A folded page slipped loose from Teresa's notebook. On it, she had typed a draft list, longer than the one she gave me, then crossed half of it out by hand. Do not rent 14. Do not answer 8 after 1. Do not follow the ice machine watcher. Do not let solitary guests remain unnamed. Do not discuss personal history on site. Do not apologize aloud. If it begins using memories you did not speak, leave before sunrise. At the bottom, she had written, the old version obeyed boundaries. The current version studies them. Outside the storage room, the laundry cycle buzzer went off with a cheap electronic chirp that made me jump hard enough to hit my shoulder on the cabinet. Papers slid to the floor. Among them was a photograph. 3 clerks standing in the office over different years, judging by the wallpaper and cash register styles, but each one posed the same way. Head slightly turned toward the front window, expression absent, as if listening to something on the other side of the glass. On the back, someone had written, former staff linger near threshold spaces, ice machine, pool fence, hallway cams, unsure whether remnants or scouts. I thought of the figure by the ice machine and felt my skin tighten. That night, Teresa arrived before my shift. For once, I didn't bother pretending patience. Why didn't you tell me room 14 was quarantined? She closed the office drawer carefully before answering. Because if I told you everything at once, you would have left. I still might. Not before dawn. The certainty in her voice bothered me more than the words. You knew it was using my past, I said. I knew it would use something. And the rules? They worked better before it learned how attached people get to instructions. Then why keep giving them? Because no rules are worse. That would have satisfied me once. A terse operational truth. Now it sounded like someone defending a failing system because failure was familiar. Who or what is it? I asked. Teresa looked tired, in a way that made age seem secondary, like something had been wearing her rather than the reverse. I stopped using names. Names make it ambitious. You expect me to stay after this? I expect you to understand you were part of it. The first night you thought you were outside it. I hated her for saying that, because it felt true in a way I could not disprove. After she left, I copied what mattered from the notebooks into my own pad. Not Teresa's rules. Not the clerk's accumulated panic. Patterns. It learned a routine. It learned names. It learned from repetition. It used guilt as an access point. I liked clear explanations because they made people stand still. Somewhere between the file cabinet and dawn, my attitude toward the motel changed. I stopped trying to prove the rules were fake. I started trying to outrun the fact that they were already obsolete. My first personal rule was simple. Never do the same thing twice if you can help it. I wrote it on a legal pad and kept it under the register. It sounded ridiculous. But then, so did most survival instructions before you tested what happened without them. If the entity at the sundown learned by studying routine, then the routine had become a collaboration. So I varied everything. I stopped using the same walkway between the office and the rooms. I changed the order of nightly checks. I brushed my teeth in the laundry sink one morning and the staff bathroom the next. When guests approached the desk, I forced myself to wait before answering, even if the pause made the interaction awkward. That became Rule 2, never answer immediately. Rule 3 followed after a salesman recoiled when I greeted him by name before he had spoken. I had not meant to do it. The name just arrived in my mouth as certainty. "Evening, Mr. Dobbs." He stared. "How do you know that?" His registration card was still blank. After he left with his key, I went cold all over. Whether I had guessed, remembered from nowhere, or repeated information the motel had already learned did not matter. I was becoming porous. So I wrote, "Never use a guest's name first." Rule 4 came from the rooms themselves. Never enter through the same door you exited if there is another way out. It sounds impossible until you live in a motel built from exterior doors, pool access, maintenance corridors, and windows badly secured enough to count as choices. The point was not elegance. The point was breakage. I wanted my movements to resemble noise. For 2 nights, it seemed to help. The calls from room 14 became less direct. The Ortega voices receded to muffled presences instead of pointed accusations. The footage still glitched, but I no longer caught myself missing frames where I knew I had been. Then I met Victor. He lived in the long-term wing, last door on the end, though lived didn't quite fit. Nothing about his room suggested settlement. It looked curated for temporary use. Bed made too tightly, toiletries aligned with military neatness, one duffel packed and zipped beside the chair, as if departure were expected, but indefinitely delayed. He was in his 60s, broad-shouldered despite the stoop age had given him, with close-cropped white hair and hands marked by old burns. He came to the office at 3 in the morning and asked for the key to the maintenance tunnel. "There is no key," I said. "There is if Teresa trusts you. She doesn't. Then you're safer than I thought." He said it without humor. I decided not to bother with pleasantries. "How long have you been here?" "Depends which version of here you mean." I almost told him to leave, but something in his face stopped me. He looked less frightened than exhausted, which by then read as credibility. "You know about the rules," I said. "I know Teresa's rules. That isn't the same thing." He glanced toward the monitor showing the ice machine. The figure was there again, motionless in the usual pool of yellow light. "Let me guess," Victor said. "She told you to ignore that one." "She did. Bad advice." "Whose side is it on?" He gave me a long look. "You still think in sides." That answer irritated me enough to keep listening. Victor had his own rule set, and it contradicted Teresa's so directly that it felt malicious. According to him, room 14 was the safest room on the property because it collected the entity's unfinished attempts, the versions not yet stable enough to move elsewhere. The office, on the other hand, was dangerous because it was where names, payments, and identities got organized. He claimed the front desk wasn't neutral ground at all. It was a sorting mechanism, a place where the motel used to turn arrivals into narratives. "And the ice machine guy?" I asked. Victor watched the monitor. "Protector, maybe. Or residue of somebody who learned how to stay useless to it. By standing around all night. By not being interesting. None of it matched Teresa's framework, which made me want to discard it. But Victor knew details he should not have known unless he'd had long practice surviving there. He asked whether the calls from 8 were still using breathing first. He asked if the pool had started smelling wet before voices were heard. He asked if room numbers were climbing or descending when they changed. When I told him I'd seen the Ortega family, hadn't said their name aloud, but he seemed to understand they were personal. He nodded as though confirming a symptom. "It found your unfinished guilt," he said. "That makes you nutritious." I should have laughed at the word. Instead, I felt sick. "Why stay here?" I asked. Victor considered that. Maybe I didn't. At 4:15, the office phone rang. Internal line. The display read 14. Victor's expression tightened. "Don't answer." That was one of Teresa's rules, too. Then maybe she got one right. The phone kept ringing. Not insistent. Patient. I let it ring out. After the fifth ring, the security monitor for the pool flickered and showed a figure standing inside the empty deep end. Small, hooded, yellow coat. I stood up too fast. Victor caught my wrist with surprising strength. That's what it wants. It's using a sequence. Call, image, pursuit. How do you know? Because it used to need us to move in straight lines. The line died. The monitor cleared. Empty pool. When I looked back at Victor, I realized his grip had left a cold numbness in my skin that lingered after he let go. "What are you?" I asked. He almost smiled. Still deciding. Then he left the office without another word. I watched him cross the courtyard. The figure by the ice machine turned slightly as he passed, as though acknowledging him. Victor did not look back. That night, for the first time, I truly didn't know who I was choosing between. Teresa with her worn procedures and half-truths. Victor with his contradictory rules and impossible knowledge. The motel itself, which had already proved that consistency might simply be the most convincing disguise. I added one more rule before sunrise. Do not assume the warning and the trap are different things. It was the first useful thing I'd written that felt honest. After Victor, the sundown stopped pretending to be fixed architecture. New rooms appeared first in ways small enough to rationalize. A housekeeping closet where I thought a blank wall had been. An extra door between 9 and 10, with no number on it until I looked away and back and found a tarnished 12B screwed into the paint. A corridor off the residence wing that ran 10 feet deeper than the building's exterior dimensions should have allowed, ending in a cinder block wall slick with old moisture. By then, I had started carrying a pencil to mark corners and door frames with tiny lines. It felt childish, but it helped me tell change from panic. The marks moved, or rather, the surfaces bearing them did. One dawn, the line I had made beside the laundry threshold appeared instead on the inside of room 8's bathroom door. Guests began remembering tomorrow. A woman checking out asked whether I had found the silver bracelet she had lost near the pool later that night. A trucker complained that the man in room 6 would spend the next morning pounding on his wall, though room 6 was empty and the trucker was scheduled to leave before sunrise. At first, I thought these were ordinary prediction distortions, people half-dreaming travel plans aloud. Then the bracelet turned up exactly where she said. The pounding came at 8:15 from an occupied room 6, whose register entry had not existed the day before. The mimics got better. Earlier versions had always felt slightly off, even when they looked human. The smile too still, the speech is too economical. But now I started meeting guests whose unease arrived late, after natural conversation, after a joke, after a complaint about ice quality or highway noise. By the time I sensed the flaw, it was usually because they knew something they shouldn't. A man in a baseball cap leaned on the counter and said, "You look less tired than the version of you in the pool window." A young woman buying a soda asked if I had ever apologized to the Ortegas in person, or only in my head. A couple checked in under the names Raul and Marisol Ortega and behaved with such convincing normalcy for 13 minutes that I nearly completed the transaction before noticing their daughter's reflection wasn't moving with her. I refused them the room. They smiled at one another, not offended in the least, and walked out into the courtyard. On the monitor, they split apart, each taking a different path, though the front lot camera later showed no one leaving the property. That was when I finally understood what the journals meant about victims becoming part of the motel. I found evidence in Teresa's old records and in the gaps between them. Repeated names attached to different handwriting. Room keys issued to people who never appeared on camera. Old lost and found items described in intimate detail by guests who claimed never to have been there before. The sundown wasn't merely causing disappearances. It was retaining useful pieces, mannerisms, fragments of memory, personal histories stripped for parts and recombined into future guests. like it was building people from salvaged components. The Ortega family kept returning, because I kept returning to them internally. The motel had learned where my guilt lived and discovered it could mine that place indefinitely. When I confronted Teresa, she looked not surprised but resigned. "It uses whatever people can't finish," she said. "And what does it do when it finishes learning someone?" Her silence answered too well. I went looking for Victor and found his room empty except for the bed, the aligned toiletries, and a legal pad on the dresser, with 6 lines written in block capitals. "It can only imitate what it can organize. Disorder isn't safety. It's just harder to eat. The tunnel isn't below. If it speaks as you, leave the office." The man by the ice machine was a clerk. If you hear water, run toward it or away from it. Never wait to decide. I was still staring at the 4th line when the intercom snapped alive over the office door. The Sundown had an old PA system Teresa never used, a relic from when the motel apparently announced wake-up calls or pool hours. I had forgotten the speakers even worked. A burst of static washed through the office. Then a voice said, very clearly, "Why are you afraid of becoming someone else when you've spent your whole life pretending to be someone you're not?" My own voice. Not a rough imitation. Mine. With the same flattening on the word spent, the same dry quality it got when I hadn't slept. I stood so quickly my chair fell backward. The speaker hissed softly, waiting. Every instinct told me not to answer, but the question had slid under my defenses with surgical precision. I had pretended objectivity while destroying a family for a promotion. I had pretended boredom while trespassing on rules I didn't respect. I had pretended I came to the Sundown only for work, when really, I came because it was far enough from my old life to feel like erasure. "Mason," the intercom said in my voice, almost gently. "You keep calling survival honesty." Something pounded once on the wall behind the key rack, then again, then from farther away, as if the sound had moved into another room without crossing the space between. I backed out of the office and into the courtyard. The desert night felt abruptly wet. The pool smelled like a lake turned over by a storm despite containing no water at all. At the far end, beside the ice machine, the motionless figure had turned toward me fully for the first time. Moonlight hit his face. He was not a stranger. He was one of the men from Teresa's old photograph. Younger there, of course, but unmistakable. Square jaw, deep-set eyes, same white work shirt. A former clerk. He raised one hand, not beckoning, not warning exactly, more like directing my attention. Beyond him, the wall behind room 14 now held another door where there had never been one before. No number, no knob, just a seam in the stucco, outlined by a hairline glow from within. When I looked back toward the office, the front window reflected me standing there in the courtyard. Only my reflection was smiling. That was the moment I stopped wondering whether I could outsmart the motel by finding the correct rules. It was smarter than that now, and it was getting smarter through me. The final night announced itself with occupancy. At 6:53, before full dark, the vacancy sign began flickering, hard enough to buzz like an insect trapped in wire. By 7:10, every room key hook except 14's was gone, though I had checked in only 3 guests. By 8, there were cars in spaces I hadn't seen anyone park in. A station wagon with one door missing, a fresh black SUV coated in desert dust, an old sedan with a child seat in back and no plates. The register pages wouldn't hold still long enough to count. Names appeared, blurred, corrected themselves. By 9, the motel was full, not on paper, physically. Doors opening, toilets flushing, TV noises leaking through the walls, footsteps crossing the upper walkway that the Sundown did not actually possess. People moved in every direction with the practiced entitlement of paying guests, and I could no longer tell which ones had arrived by road and which had assembled themselves out of the property's inventory of stolen memory. Teresa was nowhere. Victor's room stood open and empty. The journals in the office drawer had rewritten themselves into blank pages, except for one sentence repeating in different handwriting down the margins. Old methods become paths. At 10:30, the pool filled, this time with water first. Dark, glassy, impossible in a basin that had been cracked concrete that morning. Then shapes rose within it, heads, shoulders, faces turning up beneath the surface, as if watching from under ice. When I blinked, the water was gone, and people were standing in the empty basin, exactly where the reflections had been. The Ortega family, why, among them, Teresa too. The man from room 14, at 3 different ages. A dozen other faces I knew only through the motel's fragmentary intimacy. The salesman, the Bakersfield father, the woman who lost the bracelet tomorrow. The intercom came alive. "Good evening," my voice said. "We are no longer accepting reservations." Something in me nearly broke then, not from fear alone, from the sheer administrative obscenity of hearing annihilation speak in motel courtesy. I tried Teresa's rules first out of reflex, locked the office, refused calls, avoided the pool gate, ignored the ice machine figure. Everything worsened. The office door unlocked itself. Room 8 was called from every internal line at once. The figure beside the ice machine stepped closer to the window and tapped once on the glass, hard enough to make it ring. Victor's rule about old methods becoming paths suddenly felt less metaphorical than operational. The motel knew every avoidance pattern. It anticipated fear. It could model obedience. So I did the only thing left that hadn't already been taught to it. I quit trying to be correct. No new rules, no system, no orderly sequence of survival behaviors. I grabbed the flashlight, left the office through the back instead of the front, for no reason other than that I hadn't done it before. Cut through the laundry, climbed the rear fence halfway, dropped back down, crossed the courtyard diagonally, entered room 11, exited through the bathroom window, doubled back through the residence wing, and opened the impossible door behind room 14. Not because it made sense, because it didn't. The door opened into the maintenance tunnel, Teresa said, which was sealed, except Victor had written that the tunnel wasn't below, and he had been right. The space beyond felt slanted in a way my body understood before my eyes did, like I had stepped into architecture remembering a different gravity. Concrete walls sweated cold water. Pipes ran overhead, though some disappeared into darkness where the corridor bent upward instead of down. Room numbers had been painted on the walls at intervals, but not in order. 2, 14, 8.14 again. Then my own name in block letters, as if assigned lodging. Behind me, the intercom carried through hidden speakers. "Mason," it said, voice shifting now between mine, Teresa's, a child's, the man from 14. "Procedure has become impolite." I laughed once, breathless and ugly. It startled me enough to keep going. That was the thing the motel had never accounted for. Random action isn't bravery. Sometimes it's just deterioration. I was no longer making decisions from a stable center. I was lashing against prediction. I opened sealed doors without checking. One led into the laundry room from the wrong side. Another into an occupied guest bathroom where a woman brushed her teeth and looked at me in the mirror without surprise. Another into the dry pool basin, where the assembled figures turned their heads as one. I backed out before they could speak. At some point, the flashlight died. Good. Light had become another habit. I moved by instinct and sound, toward noise, then away from it, trusting whichever impulse arrived first. Water dripping? I ran toward it once, and found a corridor full of key cards hanging from strings like chimes. The next time I heard it, I turned away and ended up in the front office, though I was certain I had been near the residence wing. Each irrational choice seemed to frustrate the place. Doors slammed too late to trap me. Voices called from the wrong directions. The Ortega girl appeared at the end of one hall in her yellow coat and asked, "Why didn't you save us?" I shut my eyes and walked past her, not because I was strong enough to resist, because if I stopped to answer, I'd be doing what was expected. The motel began to unravel under that pressure. Hallways lengthened, then snapped shorter. The pool reappeared full of black water, then dry, then tiled over. Room numbers spun on their plaques like compass needles. The guests started repeating themselves with small errors, like copies of copies, losing integrity. Finally, so I end up at the ice machine. The former clerk stood beside it as always, pale shirt glowing under the lot light. Up close, Sis's face looked exhausted rather than dead. "What do I do?" I asked. It was the first direct question I'd asked anyone there that felt honest. He looked past me toward the office, where every light was now on. "Stop giving it witness," he said. His voice was rough, unused. "How?" He met my eyes for the first time. "Choose something that has nothing to do with fear." That answer made no sense, which was perhaps why it was the first useful one. Beyond him, the intercom shrieked with static. The assembled guests in the pool began climbing toward the rim, not fast, not hunting, coming forward with the confidence of people who knew eventually I would need a pattern again. So I did the least strategic thing of my life. I walked into room 14 and lay down on the bed. No barricade, no weapon, no appeal for mercy. I took off my shoes because they were filling with grit and because I was suddenly, absurdly tired of them hurting my feet. I stared at the water stain on the ceiling. I counted backward from 100, then sideways through the alphabet, then recited the names of random claims adjusters from my old office, not because any of it might save me, but because none of it belonged to the motel's story about me. Outside, doors banged. The intercom voice spoke in rapid fragments. Someone knocked once, twice, then began using my own rhythm of breathing against the door. I kept counting nonsense. The room got colder, then hotter, then, very slowly, quiet. When the sunlight hit my face, I was still in bed, and the motel was normal. Morning at the sundown had the cruelty of bad evidence. It made everything look too plain. The pool was dry concrete again. The lot held only 3 cars, all belonging to guests whose records matched their keys. The office register showed no sign of the extra occupants, no overwritten pages, no crawling names. The journals were back in the storage cabinet where I had found them, though Teresa's notebook was missing. Victor's room in the residence wing had been stripped to motel basics, as if no one had lived there for years. I found no trace of Teresa's pickup, no forwarding address in the office files, no emergency contact besides a disconnected landline in Tucson. Payroll envelopes for the week sat under the register, mine included, as if a tired owner intended to return after errands and never did. The figure by the ice machine was gone. When I checked the security footage from the night before, the recordings were either blank or uselessly ordinary. The most revealing clip showed me leaving the office around 11 and then nothing else until sunrise. When I crossed the courtyard from the direction of room 14, unlocked the office, and stood at the desk for nearly a minute without moving. There was something wrong with the way I held myself in that clip. Too still, too composed, like someone practicing being me after careful study. I took the envelope of cash, packed my duffel, and left before noon. No note, no report to the county, no noble final effort to warn strangers. Maybe that was cowardice. Maybe it was the first pragmatic decision I had made in months. I did not believe police tape would hold what the rules could only slow. I did not believe explanations would survive contact with daylight bureaucracy. Most of all, I did not trust myself to describe the place without also enlarging it. For weeks after, I drifted east through temporary jobs and cheaper motels, sleeping lightly, avoiding pools, refusing to learn the names of night clerks. The desert slowly gave way to plains, then low industrial towns, then interstate exits full of chain restaurants and gas stations bright enough to make all mystery feel provincial. I told myself, distance mattered. Some nights, I almost believed it. Then came the small things. A vacancy sign at a motor court in Oklahoma flickered off exactly as I pulled in, though all the other neon on the strip remained steady. A woman in a red coat asked me at a vending machine whether the tunnel was open, then laughed and said, "Sorry, wrong place," before I could answer. In Nebraska, a child in a breakfast room said I looked familiar from the motel with the dry pool, though her parents insisted they had never been farther west than Denver. I never stayed anywhere longer than one night after that. I also never told anyone my full story, not because I wanted to protect them, because I couldn't shake the fear that narration itself was one more way to feed the thing, one more orderly path laid down between event and witness. So I made my life smaller. Cash payments, short check-ins, no forwarding addresses, no photographs if I could help it. But secrecy is not the same as escape. About 4 months after I left the Sundown, I checked into a roadside motel outside Amarillo just before dawn, after driving all night through freezing rain. The place was generic, in the aggressively comforting way chains try to be. Fresh paint, beige walls, fake succulents near the lobby coffee station. The clerk was a college kid who barely looked up from his phone while issuing me the key. Room 116, second floor. Nothing unusual. I remember standing in the doorway and feeling ridiculous for inspecting the room corners, the bathroom mirror, and the ventilation grate. Everything was standard. 2 queen beds, cheap landscape print above the headboard, ice bucket on the dresser, Bible in the drawer. I shut the door, turned on the lamp, and laughed under my breath at myself. Then I opened the bedside drawer. Inside, beside the motel Bible, lay a folded sheet of paper, typed. Fresh black toner, no yellowing, no creases except the one made to fit the drawer. My hands were already shaking before I unfolded it. The rules were familiar enough that I did not have to read them in order. Do not rent room 8 after midnight. If a guest asks for room 14, tell them it is under renovation. Never enter the pool area after 2 in the morning. Ignore anyone standing beside the ice machine. If the vacancy sign turns off by itself, lock the office door. The page continued. New instructions below the old ones, cleanly added. Do not answer if a room calls and asks whether you remember the desert. If a former night clerk checks in, do not let him stay past sunrise. There was something else in the drawer, a photograph. Security camera still, slightly grainy, timestamp cropped off. It showed an ice machine beside a row of exterior motel rooms, and there I was, standing beside it, perfectly still, head slightly bowed, as if listening, not as I looked now, exhausted and rain-soaked and older around the eyes. In the photo, I wore the pale work shirt from Teresa's old picture of the former clerk. My posture matched his exactly. One hand hung at my side. The other was raised a few inches from the machine, fingers loose, as though I was about to point something out to someone just outside the frame. On the back of the photo, in small typed letters, were the words, "Watching helps." I don't remember dropping the picture, only hearing it strike the carpet. The room suddenly smelled faintly of chlorine and hot dust. From somewhere outside, close enough to belong to this property, far enough to still be deniable, I heard the metallic clack of ice falling into an empty tray. I stood there for a long time without moving, because movement would have made the next fact harder to avoid. The rules had traveled, or something had learned to carry them. And if the new instruction was for other clerks, not for me, then that meant the lesson the Sundown took from my survival wasn't how to stop hunting, it was how to leave home. At sunrise, someone knocked once on my door, in the same patient rhythm I had heard outside room 14. I didn't answer. I still don't know whether that mattered.